He said when his son's car left the road and went into the harbor, that God's was the first of all our hearts to break. And that phrase to me captures who God is. That's the God that I know through Jesus Christ, the God who suffers with us. That's the God that I choose to believe in, the God who is with us through all the ups and downs of life, and the God whose heart breaks when our hearts break.
Welcome to the More Than Sunday podcast, where we tackle tough questions about our faith that many people have but are often afraid to ask. I'm Rohini Drake, and I'm on staff here at First United Methodist Church Richardson, and each week I'm joined by two guests who share their perspectives on some of these tough questions. Now, for season 6 of this podcast, we asked you to share your questions that you've been wrestling with. And for this episode, we had overwhelming feedback that people wanted to have an answer for the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And so because of that, we've invited two guests here. We're so grateful that Pastor Clayton Oliphint is here, who's the senior pastor of FUMCR, and Allison Jean, who's our new modern worship pastor here at FUMCR. Thank you both for joining us and being willing to share your perspectives on this tough question. And Allison, since you're new to this podcast and new to FUMCR, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself, how you got here to FUMCR and maybe where you're from and a little bit about your family?
I would love to. So I am from Oklahoma originally, very small little town, and grew up there, got my call to ministry when I was about 15 years old, born and raised United Methodist, and had just an incredible home church that was very supportive of that, as well as my family. And so I went to Oklahoma City University, go Stars, where I majored in religion and just had a ton of affirmation that ministry is what I wanted to do and felt called to do and felt most myself when I was doing. And so I started seminary in Chicago, and in the midst of that journey, met my husband, and we decided we wanted to land in North Texas. So eventually transferred to Perkins School of Theology, graduated there, and we've been here for 7 years. I served at St. Andrew United Methodist for those 7 years, first as an intern and then as a pastor, and just loved my time there. It was just a great experience. The people there are wonderful. And almost a year ago, felt this kind of stirring in my spirit that I might be called somewhere else. And so talked to the leadership of the conference and let them know that. And then this guy texted me and said, "Hey, do you want to have coffee?" And in the midst of that, last fall, we had our first child. His name is Calvin. He is the most adorable baby. Not that I'm biased, but he is. And so started here in July, and it's been amazing. So just really glad to be here.
Well, we're so glad that you're here and glad that you're sharing some time with us to tackle some of these tough questions. And so for your first episode, we're starting with...
Thanks for making it easy. Yeah.
We do what we can. So for me, this question has passed through my head at various different stages throughout my life. You know, from the time, you're young and a pet dies and you're like, man, I did everything right. Why did a bad thing happen to me? And then, of course, being Christians, we also bring God into this. Like, how does this affect our faith and our relationship with God? And so when we read through questions that people submitted, it came in different formats. And one of the ways that it was expressed was, if God is all-powerful and loves us, why does God let bad things happen to us?
Rohini, this is a question that I think almost every person wrestles with it at some time in their lives. A lot of times you never think about it until something bad happens and you're trying to figure out, well, there's some things that make sense and then some things that just don't make any sense at all. So, how can a loving God allow or cause bad things to happen. It's a mystery. There's a word for this in theological circles. It's called theodicy, and theo, God. The second part, the dicey part, is dike, which means justice, and that has to do with God, the sense of God's justice. How do we make sense of that when, they're unfair, clearly unfair things that happen in this world? So one of the ways that I've talked about it is to think about it this way, of a continuum, if you will, that if you have on one extreme side that God determines everything that happens, that there's nothing that happens without God determining that, and that for instance, the cool parking place that I landed by the church today was a direct result of God just smiling on me and blessing me, opening that. And that was determined a long time ago. And I've heard people say, well, all of this is predetermined. Everything happens as it is according to plan. And you'll hear, God is sovereign. And by sovereignty, they mean powerful in terms of control, that God controls everything that happens. Now, on the other end of that continuum is kind of randomness, that nothing is ordered, and if there is a God in this scenario, then God has nothing to do, that everything just happens randomly, and there's no rhyme or reason to anything that happens. And so if those were the only two options that you had, which I think a lot of us do, a lot of people say, well, if God's going to be like that, then I'm going to choose to believe in nothing. I've had people say that to me, that everything just seems so random. But randomness doesn't feel right either. So is there an option in between? So for me, I found this, isn't there some way in between that we could understand this? That there is a loving God who is involved in our lives and yet gives us free will and loves us enough not to control everything that happens, but chooses to, in love, let us have freedom. And that freedom has incredible consequences, both positive and negative. That there are things, because of that freedom we've been given, there are things that absolutely are terrible that can happen.
I think it's important to think about, when we're asking that question, what are we really searching for in the midst of that? And why are we asking it? Is it because we need to know the logical, rational understanding of it, or is it because we're searching for some kind of comfort in the midst of that? We didn't share this a ton with people, but when my son was born, we had about a month of normalcy, and then he was actually diagnosed with a heart defect that most of the time is caught before a baby is born. And so we were the weird ones that we didn't know was there, and were thrown into crisis mode of hearing a doctor say, your child is actively dying and he has to have surgery tomorrow. And that turned into 2 different surgeries. And in the midst of that, I hope people hear that I, as a pastor who went to seminary and who has been a Christian my whole life, and, I do this professionally, sat in the middle of that hospital room and thought, why is this happening to us? Why is this happening to my kid who has been around for a month, who is nothing but pure love and goodness? There is nothing that he has done to deserve this. And I think it's important to really just kind of interrogate within ourselves, what am I really looking for in the midst of that question? Is it really that I want to know the pattern of cause and effect that brought this about? Or is it that I am looking for some kind of comfort, some kind of reassurance? And it was really after, about 8 hours of chaos, and we finally get Cal checked into the ICU at Medical City Dallas, just down the street. And if you've ever been in the hospital, then you know that there comes a time right after shift change, around 10 p.m. or so, that everything kind of just quiets, and all the healthcare workers go to their different stations and settle in, and they turn the lights out. And I got to stay overnight with him because he was so new and young. And it just sort of fell quiet, and that question popped into my mind again. And the words of "Great is thy faithfulness" just kind of floated into my head. And I sang that to him in the midst of the machines beeping and all the chaos finally quieted down. And that was really what I was looking for. It's not that I wanted to know what genes aligned when he was created that caused this heart defect to come up and all the chaos that came from it. I just wanted to know that God was there and that God was present and that God is faithful. And that faithfulness doesn't always look like a cure, but I just found that glimpse of peace. And that didn't solve it all. I mean, I am having regular conversations with my therapist about everything that has unfolded since then. And Calvin is good, by the way. He is great, and he will get to play sports, much to the relief of my husband. He will get to play football and golf and all those things. And so it's not like it was a quick fix, but just knowing that was really what I wanted was just knowing that God was there and that God had not abandoned us or left us or forgot us in the midst of hard things.
That's really, I think you're onto something, because I think when you confront a situation or something comes up, it feels like someone pulled your foundation out from underneath you, and you feel off balance, and you've done the right things. You've worshiped God. You've given your life. You've done all these things, and
I made A's in seminary. I made A's,
and yet, all of us are vulnerable. And we don't like that when we realize we're all vulnerable. Bad things happen to good people, and they don't make sense. And that sense of God, in this, if God didn't cause it, if there's not a reason for it, well, how is God a part of it? And you just named that. God was present with you. And for me, when we say God is all powerful, I look at the lens of Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection. And what did he show us about God's power? That God's power is made perfect in love. That God's power is made perfect when he emptied himself of all control and power and chose to love us. I think of God like that God's power is presence. And so when bad things happen, that's where I choose to go, is we lean on God's presence. God is with us. I've searched the scriptures trying to find an answer, why do bad things happen to good people? And the only answer that makes sense to me is, I am with you. That's God's answer.
Well, and I think the other challenge in the midst of that, in that question, why do bad things happen to good people? Mm-hmm. So we as humans like to categorize of, you're either good or you're bad. And so bad things should happen to bad people and good things should happen to good people. But the messiness of God's grace is that we're not categorized like that as human beings. It's not that you're either a good person or a bad person, but instead every person is redeemable. Every person is a child of God. And so it's just that bad things happen to people.
Yeah.
Sure.
And good things happen to people.
Yeah, good things happen to us who feel like we're good people, and they can also happen to people that we see as, how could that person possibly deserve a good or positive thing to happen? And not only that, sometimes they thrive, and it makes us wonder and question. So do you think then that God has a purpose for that, as we know that he's with us in those situations? That is there a reason sometimes that we go through challenges? Like, do we see, or going through your experience, Allison, do you see the other side of it yet, to say, I can see how this has helped me in my relationship, in my faith?
Yeah, I think there's very much a big distinction between God causing something and God redeeming something. I do not think that God ever wished or willed that my husband and I would go through the crisis of someone saying, your son is actively dying, this is an emergency, and Cal having, a scar from the surgery, right? That is not something that God willed or put on us or wanted in any way, shape, or form. But I understand what it is to sit in a hospital room and wait for the surgeon to come and tell you that it went well in a way that I didn't know that before. I didn't know what that experience was like, the anxiety, and it has changed who I am as a pastor. It has changed how I pray with people. It has changed how I visit people in hospitals. It has changed everything. I feel like I am a better pastor because of it. And so I am seeing how God is redeeming that experience in ways that are good and beautiful. And again, it brings to mind that concept of Emmanuel, of God with us, that of course God is all powerful because God knows what it is to be human in the most excruciating and intimate way possible, that God knows what it is to be abandoned by your friends. God knows what it is to be on a cross. God knows what it is to be human in a way that just deepens our relationship and in a way that just lets us know that God is here and with us. And so I don't think God put that on us in any way, shape, or form. And anyone, I would say, who tries to answer circumstances like that with simple, clear-cut, easy answers is doing a disservice to the person they're talking to. I have been to seminary. I have sat through all the classes. I do not have an easy answer for any of the questions we're talking about today. And that is okay. We have to have peace with that it's above my pay grade to know what it means, what all the answers are. And so anytime we try to oversimplify, that's usually when harm is done, right? When someone has come up to me and said, there must be a reason that Cal went through all this. And, someday you'll find out what that is. Well, what they're trying to make it is simple and easy to understand, and some things just aren't. And that's okay. It's a holy mystery, and we just have to learn to sit with that.
Yeah, that's great. And I like that in Romans 8 where Paul says, people will quote it, all things work together for good. And if you believe God determined everything that happened, you're looking for, okay, God's going to do something with this to bring good out of it. But the phrase, as I read that in the Greek, in all things God is at work for good. It's not everything that happens is good. It's that in every situation God is at work for good. I lost my little brother to brain cancer at the age of 42. And Kelly's life, was a bright, shining star. He made a lot of impact in this world. And, there's nothing about that situation that for me doesn't suck. I'll just say it that way. And it will always suck. There's nothing that can ever make that right in one sense. What I choose to look at is the good that God did in his life and how God then brought together other circumstances that the way people cared, the way friends were drawn closer together, the way people were praying it was drawing them closer to God. All the different ways that good came out of his life. His death will never be good for me, but there's good that God brought, and I look at his son and what he's doing and things like that brings you a lot of joy but there's a sense in which you never come to terms with some bad things that happen, and yet you can trust that God has been at work in your life for good in some way, that God was part of that. And I think for me personally, it was just knowing God was present and that he was not alone, he is not alone, that we were not alone, that God was with us every step of the way. So God's presence to me, again, is the answer to that. There's no answer to the question. God's presence is God's answer to me. I'm with you. And that's enough. It doesn't make everything right. It doesn't clean it all up and tie a bow on it. But somehow it's enough, God's presence.
And I think that's true of people too. We feel this pressure of, I have to say the right thing. I have to do the right thing if someone that we love is experiencing a tragedy like this. And really, the most comfort to me was when somebody made us dinner and brought it and sat with us in the waiting room at the hospital. Didn't say anything except, I'm so sorry this happened. That's it. That's all we needed, right? Food and and comfort in that and presence. That's all you have to do, you know? I mean, we can get into asking questions and being there in the midst of all that later, but in the midst of a crisis, we don't have to give any answers because that's not really what any of us are looking for.
I love that because as we look to God as the model for how we are with people when they're going through hard times, that God tells us, just be. And so for looking for any practical solutions or advice on how to deal with something like that as a community of faith, that we know that what's most helpful and what God would do for us is to just be with us. And so I feel like that is very helpful to focus on and to realize that that's what you've come to see through tragedies and heartbreak and people that are struggling with this question. So the last question I have is do you have any resources for people that are maybe struggling with this question that have maybe personally helped you with whatever journey it is, whether it's with your experience with Calvin in the hospital or other things that you would suggest, podcasts or books, anything you would want to share right now?
I would say first, if you're a person who has experienced trauma, and that's what it is. That's something I have had to struggle with because Cal's story was, really exactly what you would want to happen in that scenario. A doctor is the one who diagnosed it. We were not at home in the midst of a crisis. We were just at a doctor's office and they found the problem and addressed it, and he's good and totally normal. But I had to practice naming, even though the end of the story is good, we still went through a lot of trauma in the midst of it and dealing with all of that. And so I think if you're a person who has gone through something like that, give yourself time. I tried to start reading a book in January about some of this, and I just realized I'm not ready. The chapter started talking about the hospital and even the noise of the machines and all that kind of stuff. And it was just nope, I'm not there yet. So first and foremost, give yourself time, whether it's you or someone that you love. If you're not ready to go through that yet, that's okay. But for me, I read a lot of Kate Bowler's work. She's a professor at Duke, and she herself was diagnosed with a really serious cancer diagnosis and is in the midst of managing it. Not that it's curable, but it's currently manageable. And she just really talked about these plans in our head that we don't realize we have until something changes them. And how do you deal with the grief of that and kind of releasing those things and just realizing that things can have worth in the moment, even if the end of the story is not what we would want. And so she's been really helpful. And then I actually there's a song that one of my favorite bands, they're called Johnny Swim, just came out with, and it's called Devastating. And it's about their marriage and their devotion to one another and really how the end of a marriage is going to end in heartbreak, right? Because one of you will probably pass before the other and you will experience grief and all this kind of stuff. And that's how it's supposed to be, right? The cost of love is that eventually there will be grief. And I think just realizing that grief in and of itself is not inherently a bad thing. It's difficult, it's heavy, but it's coming from a place of love. You wouldn't grieve something that you didn't love. And so I think those have been really helpful for me. And then just being part of a church before there's a crisis, right? We survived the whole thing with Calvin because we had a church who came beside us, who knew us well enough to know what we needed. And so investing before any of that ever happens just makes all the difference in the world.
I think that makes a huge difference to have a community that walks with you through all the ups and downs of life. And we go through so much and life is challenging, and to have a community of people, in a church community particularly, where we trust that somehow God is a part of this and God is with us as a part of this. One of the resources I've pointed people to through the years is a sermon by William Sloane Coffin, and it's a very famous sermon that he preached. He was the pastor of the Riverside Church in New York City, and his son died in a car accident. And I met him just a couple of months after his son's death, and he told us the story and his preaching of this sermon. But the sermon itself is a powerful tribute of love to his son. But he uses this phrase, and it's really helped me through the years. He said, when his son's car left the road and went into the harbor, that God's was the first of all our hearts to break. And that phrase to me captures who God is. That's the God that I know through Jesus Christ, the God who suffers with us. That's the God that I choose to believe in, the God who is with us through all the ups and downs of life, and the God whose heart breaks when our hearts break. To me, that sermon itself is worth a read if you're struggling with this, because I think he tries to explain some of the, God does do this, God doesn't do this. That whole idea of that everything that happens is God's will, he pretty much, he says you need to read your Bible more.
Well, I want to thank you both for being here and tackling this question with us. I know that I'm walking out of this space with a different perspective and a better perspective, I think, on the good versus the bad, and just being in it with people and when things are happening, and knowing that God is with me as well. So I really thank you for that. I know it will help a lot of people that are listening and watching. All of the resources that were mentioned during the podcast, we're going to make available on our website, fumcr.com/morethansunday. So the band that Allison mentioned, the sermon that Clayton mentioned, we'll make sure that you have all of that information if you'd like to check it out and find where you can check out more information about this topic, about this question. And I really do hope that you all join us next Wednesday when we tackle another tough question with two new guests. And you can watch on our YouTube channel, since this is a video podcast now, at youtube.com/FUMCR, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again for listening. I hope you have a great day.